a frozen Mustang, a missing child, and a discovery that would shatter a hardened cowboy's heart. When 72-year-old rancher Jacob "Jake" Morrison rode out into the Wyoming blizzard searching for a lost 6-year-old boy, he never expected to find what he did at the base of Eagle Ridge. A wild Mustang stallion, frozen in the snow, its body curved in an unmistakable protective position. And beneath the horse, impossibly, miraculously, the child was still alive. But the story of how that wild horse ended up there, why it made the choice it did, and what it cost to save a human child it had never met, would challenge everything Jake thought he knew about wild animals and the depth of their capacity for compassion. If stories of extraordinary animal heroism and the mysterious bonds that connect all living things move you, hit that subscribe button right now. What unfolds next will stay with you forever. The call came through on Jake Morrison's radio at 3:47 p.m. on a February afternoon that would be remembered as one of the worst blizzards in Wyoming history. A 6-year-old boy, Tommy Fletcher, had been reported missing from his family's ranch on the outskirts of Buffalo, Wyoming, last seen 2 hours earlier playing in the barn. Disappeared sometime between 1:30 and 2 p.m., right as the blizzard intensified from bad to catastrophic. Jake was no stranger to search and rescue operations. At 72 years old, he'd spent 55 years working ranches across Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. He'd survived countless blizzards, found lost cattle in whiteout conditions, and participated in more than a dozen search operations for missing hikers and hunters over the decades. His weathered face and gnarled hands told the story of a life lived outdoors, in partnership with the land and its harsh realities. But searching for a missing child was different. The stakes were different. The timeline was different. An adult could potentially survive a few hours in a blizzard if they found shelter and stayed calm. A 6-year-old child? In sub-zero temperatures with wind chills approaching -40 degrees? Jake knew the statistics, and they weren't good. Hypothermia could set in within 30 minutes. Unconsciousness could follow in an hour. After 2 hours in these conditions, they'd likely be searching for a body, not a survivor. Jake saddled his quarter horse, Dusty, a 20-year-old gelding who'd been his faithful companion through countless rides. Some of the other searchers were using snowmobiles and ATVs, but Jake trusted a horse's instincts in these conditions. Horses could sense things machines couldn't: wind direction, dangerous ice, changes in terrain hidden under snow. And Dusty knew this land almost as well as Jake did. The Fletcher Ranch bordered the open range where wild Mustang herds roamed freely. Jake had seen these horses countless times over the years. Magnificent, hardy creatures descended from Spanish horses brought to North America centuries ago. They'd learned to survive Wyoming's brutal winters through adaptation and instinct. The local herds usually moved to lower elevations during the worst storms, finding shelter in canyons and valleys where the wind was less fierce and vegetation was more accessible. But this storm had come up faster than forecasters predicted. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours. Visibility was near zero. Even experienced outdoorsmen were getting disoriented. Jake coordinated with the other search teams via radio. Tommy's father, Robert Fletcher, was out searching despite being barely coherent with panic and grief. The boy's mother, Sarah, had stayed at the house in case Tommy found his way back. Law enforcement had been notified. The county sheriff's department had deployed every available officer. A helicopter was grounded due to weather. This was old-school search and rescue, people on horses and foot, covering grid patterns, calling a child's name into a wind that swallowed their voices. Jake took the eastern quadrant, heading toward Eagle Ridge, a rocky outcropping about 2 miles from the Fletcher ranch house. It wasn't the most likely direction for a child to wander. It was uphill, difficult terrain, exposed to the worst of the wind. But Jake had learned over decades that lost people, especially children, often made counterintuitive choices. Fear and disorientation could send someone in any direction. As Dusty trudged through snow that reached his chest in places, Jake scanned the landscape constantly, looking for any anomaly, any shape or color that didn't belong. The world had been reduced to white and gray. Snow, sky, the vague outlines of rocks and trees, all blending into a monochromatic nightmare. Calling Tommy's name was almost useless in the howling wind, but Jake did it anyway, his voice hoarse from the cold and effort. He'd been searching for 45 minutes when Dusty suddenly stopped and refused to move forward. Jake knew his horse well enough to trust this reaction. Dusty's ears were pricked forward, his nostrils flaring despite the freezing air. The gelding sensed something ahead that Jake couldn't yet see or hear. "What is it, boy?" Jake murmured, leaning forward in the saddle and straining to see through the curtain of blowing snow. And then he saw it. A dark shape at the base of Eagle Ridge about 50 yards ahead. Too large to be the child alone. Not the right shape for a rock formation. As Jake urged Dusty closer, his heart began to pound with a mixture of hope and dread. The shape resolved into something Jake's mind struggled to process at first. It was a horse. A Mustang, from the look of it. A stallion, probably around 15 hands high, with a dark bay coat now covered in a thick layer of frost and ice. The horse was lying on its side in the snow, positioned against a large boulder that provided minimal shelter from the wind. And the horse wasn't moving. Jake dismounted from Dusty, his boots sinking into the deep snow. His first thought was that he'd found a wild Mustang that had died in the storm. Tragic, but not uncommon in blizzards this severe. But as he approached, something about the horse's position struck him as odd. The stallion was lying in a tight curve, its body bent almost into a C shape, its head and neck stretched forward, its legs drawn up. It was a protective position, the position a mother animal would take to shelter her young. Jake's breath caught in his throat as realization crashed over him. He broke into a struggling run through the snow, falling twice before reaching the frozen Mustang. And there, in the space created by the horse's curved body, sheltered against the boulder and protected from the direct fury of the blizzard, was Tommy Fletcher. The boy was unconscious, his small body completely still, his lips blue, his skin pale as the snow around him. But he was positioned in a way that told a story Jake could barely comprehend. Tommy was tucked against the horse's chest and belly, the Mustang's body having created a pocket of relative warmth and protection from the wind. The horse's head was stretched forward, positioned so its warm breath would have been directed toward the child's face. "Dear God," Jake breathed, dropping to his knees beside the boy. His hands were shaking, from cold, from adrenaline, from the emotional impact of what he was witnessing, as he reached for Tommy's neck to check for a pulse. It was there. Faint, dangerously slow but present. The boy was alive. Jake's rancher instincts and his decades of experience with hypothermia cases took over. He grabbed his radio with fumbling fingers. "This is Morrison. I've found the boy. East side of Eagle Ridge. He's alive but critical hypothermia. I need immediate medical evacuation, but the chopper won't make it in these conditions. Get ground transport with warming equipment to my coordinates ASAP." He didn't wait for confirmation. Jake stripped off his heavy winter coat and wrapped it around Tommy's small body, then pulled the boy away from the dead Mustang and against his own chest, trying to share his body heat. The child was frighteningly cold, his small body stiff and unresponsive. But as Jake lifted Tommy, he got his first clear look at the Mustang stallion, and what he saw made tears freeze on his weathered cheeks. The horse had multiple injuries. Its legs bore scrapes and cuts, some deep, consistent with running through rough terrain at high speed. There was blood frozen in its nostrils, but most telling was its position and the condition of its coat. The side of the horse that had been exposed to the wind was covered in a thick layer of ice, its fur matted and frozen solid. But the side that had been sheltering Tommy was different. Less ice, less frost, because the horse had been generating and directing its body heat inward toward the child, not outward toward its own exposed side. The Mustang had frozen to death while actively trying to keep Tommy warm. Jake looked at the trail of disturbed snow leading to this spot and could reconstruct what must have happened. Tommy had wandered away from his ranch, gotten disoriented in the rapidly worsening storm, and ended up here at Eagle Ridge. The wild Mustang, a stallion that should have been with its herd, should have been in sheltered lowlands, should have been anywhere but here, had somehow encountered the lost child. And instead of fleeing from the human, instead of following its survival instincts to seek shelter for itself, the Mustang had stayed with Tommy. It had positioned itself to provide maximum protection. It had curled its body around the child. It had quite literally sacrificed its own life to keep a human child alive just a little bit longer. "Why?" Jake whispered, looking at the frozen stallion through his tears. "Why did you do this? You didn't know him. You had no reason to stay. You could have survived if you'd just kept moving." But even as he asked, Jake understood. Because he'd spent his life working with horses, and he knew them to be capable of compassion, of decision-making, of choosing actions that seemed to transcend mere instinct. This Mustang had seen a vulnerable living creature in distress and had made a choice that went against every survival instinct, a choice that cost everything, a choice that was, in its own way, heroic. Jake held Tommy close, his own body heat gradually transferring to the boy. He could hear the approaching sound of engines, snowmobiles or ATVs, the ground rescue team making their way through the impossible conditions. Help was coming for Tommy. But for the Mustang, help had come too late. Jake looked at the frozen stallion, its dark eyes still open, crystallized with ice forever fixed in the direction of the child it had died protecting. "I'll make sure people know what you did," Jake promised, his voice breaking. "I'll make sure they understand. You saved him. Against all odds, against nature itself, you saved him." Tommy Fletcher survived. After 3 days in the pediatric intensive care unit at the regional hospital, the boy woke up with minimal lasting effects from his ordeal. He'd lost 3 toes to frostbite and would have scars on his hands, but doctors called his survival medically improbable and attributed it directly to the protection he'd received during those critical hours. The boy's memories of what happened were fragmented, seen through the confused lens of a 6-year-old's mind. He remembered getting lost. He remembered being cold and scared. He remembered a big horse appearing through the snow. He remembered the horse lying down and making warm air, and feeling safe. Then nothing until he woke up in the hospital with his parents crying and holding his hands. Jake Morrison visited Tommy in the hospital 4 days after the rescue. The old cowboy brought a gift, a photograph he'd taken on his phone during the rescue, showing the Mustang stallion in its final position. Jake had printed and framed it, and on the back he'd written the full story of what that horse had done. "When you're older, son," Jake said to Tommy, his voice gentle, You read what I wrote there. You remember what that horse did for you. That Mustang didn't have to stay. It chose to stay. It chose you over its own survival. That's a debt you can never repay. But you can honor it by living a good life, by being kind to animals, by remembering that sometimes the bravest thing in the world is choosing to protect someone else, even when it costs you everything. Tommy's parents, Robert and Sarah Fletcher, could barely speak through their tears as Jake told them the full story. The local news picked up the story, and within days it had spread nationally. The tale of the wild Mustang that froze to death, protecting a lost child, captured people's imaginations and hearts in ways that pure survival stories rarely did. But there was a problem. Jake had reported the location of the Mustang's body to the Forest Service and Bureau of Land Management, expecting them to document the incident and remove the body. But when officials went to retrieve the stallion, they couldn't find it. The blizzard had continued for another day after Tommy's rescue, dumping an additional 2 feet of snow. The stallion's body was buried somewhere under the fresh snowfall, its exact location obscured. Jake returned to Eagle Ridge 3 times in the following weeks, each time searching for the stallion's body, wanting to give the heroic horse some form of proper acknowledgement. But the area was vast, the snow was deep, and without GPS coordinates more precise than base of Eagle Ridge, finding one frozen horse under feet of snow proved impossible. It bothered Jake more than he wanted to admit. The Mustang deserved better than to be lost and forgotten under the snow. It deserved recognition. It deserved to be remembered as more than just an anonymous wild horse. And then, 6 weeks after the rescue, something remarkable happened. Jake received a call from Dr. Michael Chen, a wildlife biologist with the Bureau of Land Management, who specialized in studying Wyoming's wild Mustang populations. Dr. Chen had heard about the rescue and had a theory he wanted to discuss with Jake. They met at a diner in Buffalo, and Dr. Chen spread out maps and documents across their table. "Mr. Morrison, I've been studying the wild horse herds in this region for 15 years. I track their movements, their breeding patterns, their behavior. And I think I know which stallion saved Tommy Fletcher." Jake leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "How could you possibly know that?" Dr. Chen pulled out a photo, an image captured by one of the trail cameras the BLM used to monitor wildlife. The photo showed a magnificent bay Mustang stallion, powerful and alert, standing on a ridge backlit by sunrise. "This is Wind Dancer. That's what I've been calling him. He's the lead stallion of a herd that ranges primarily in the foothills about 15 miles west of Eagle Ridge. Wind Dancer is remarkable for several reasons. He's older than most lead stallions, probably 13 or 14 years old. Most stallions lose their herds to younger competitors by that age, but Wind Dancer has held his band together through intelligence rather than just aggression." "What makes you think this was the horse?" Jake asked, studying the photo. "2 things," Dr. Chen replied. "First, I've documented unusual behavior from Wind Dancer multiple times. 3 years ago, I watched him defend a newborn foal from his own herd against a mountain lion, taking injuries that should have driven him away, but standing his ground until the predator gave up. Last year, I documented him approaching a hiker who'd fallen and broken her leg, staying near her for over an hour until a search party arrived. Highly unusual behavior for a wild stallion. Wind Dancer has consistently shown a level of awareness and willingness to interact protectively with creatures outside his herd that I've never seen in another Mustang." "And the second thing?" Jake prompted. "The location and the timing," Dr. Chen said, pulling out a map with tracking data. "On the day of the blizzard, I had a tracker on one of Wind Dancer's mares. The herd was here," he pointed to a location on the map, "in the lowlands, exactly where they should be in a storm. But in the late morning, the stallion separated from the herd and traveled east, alone, into the storm, toward Eagle Ridge. Jake felt chills that had nothing to do with temperature. Why would he do that? That's the mystery, Dr. Chen admitted. Wild horses don't typically leave their herds during dangerous weather. They stay together for survival. But Wind Dancer left his mares and foals, his family, and traveled miles into worsening conditions, toward an area he had no practical reason to go to. Unless he sensed something, Jake said slowly. Unless somehow he knew there was a child in distress. Dr. Chen nodded. It sounds impossible. It sounds like anthropomorphizing. But the evidence is there. Wind Dancer left his herd, traveled toward Eagle Ridge, and never returned. And you found a bay stallion of the right age and size exactly where Wind Dancer's last known trajectory was heading. The revelation that the frozen stallion might be Wind Dancer, a known and documented Mustang with a history of unusual protective behavior, changed everything for Jake. This wasn't just an anonymous wild horse. This was an individual with a history, with documented acts of what could only be called compassion. Jake became obsessed with finding Wind Dancer's body, not for morbid reasons, but because the horse deserved recognition. It deserved a memorial. It deserved people to know its name and its story. As winter slowly released its grip and March brought slightly warmer temperatures, Jake organized a search party. He recruited Dr. Chen, several local ranchers, and members of the volunteer search and rescue team that had helped find Tommy. Armed with maps, GPS coordinates, metal detectors that might pick up the iron in the horse's shoes, even though wild Mustangs didn't wear shoes, they hoped to detect something. And a lot of determination, they returned to Eagle Ridge. The search took 3 full days. The area was larger and more complex than it had seemed during the blizzard. There were multiple boulders that could have provided shelter, multiple small depressions and overhangs where a horse might have positioned itself. The spring melt was underway, but there was still 3 to 4 feet of snow in many areas. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, one of the search volunteers, a young woman named Maria Santos, called out from a position about 60 yards east of where Jake thought the body should be. "I've found something." The group converged on Maria's location. She'd been probing the snow with a long pole and had encountered something solid that didn't feel like rock or frozen ground. The team began carefully excavating, using shovels to remove snow layer by layer. 20 minutes later, they uncovered him. Wind Dancer, still frozen, still in that same protective curve that had sheltered Tommy Fletcher. The spring melt hadn't yet reached deep enough to affect the body, and the Mustang was remarkably preserved, looking almost as if he were sleeping rather than dead. Dr. Chen conducted a careful examination, documenting everything with photographs and measurements. "It's definitely Wind Dancer," he confirmed, his voice thick with emotion. "I can identify him by the specific markings on his coat, the scar pattern on his left shoulder from the mountain lion encounter, the shape of his hooves. This is him." Jake knelt in the snow beside the fallen stallion, placing his weathered hand on Wind Dancer's frozen neck. "You were something special, weren't you? You made a choice that day. A choice that cost you everything, but saved a child's life. I don't know how you knew Tommy needed help. I don't know what made you leave your herd and travel into a blizzard, but you did. And because of you, a 6-year-old boy is alive and will grow up to have a full life." The question became, what to do with Wind Dancer's body? Dr. Chen wanted to conduct a necropsy to understand the horse's physical condition, to document how he died. to potentially learn something about the limits of equine endurance and decision-making. But Jake felt that would be disrespectful. Wind Dancer had given his life in an act of protection, and cutting him apart for science seemed wrong. They reached a compromise. Dr. Chen would conduct a minimal external examination and take necessary tissue samples for genetic and health analysis. But Wind Dancer's body would remain intact and would be preserved through taxidermy, not as a hunting trophy, but as a memorial, an educational exhibit, a permanent testament to his extraordinary act. The Fletcher family, when contacted, immediately agreed to fund the preservation. "That horse saved our son," Robert Fletcher said simply. "Whatever it costs to honor him properly, we'll pay it." Over the following months, Wind Dancer was preserved by one of the nation's top wildlife taxidermists, a woman named Carol Winters, who specialized in creating educational exhibits for museums. Carol worked to position Wind Dancer exactly as he'd been found, in that protective curve, head stretched forward, body shielding the space where Tommy had lain. And in that space where the child had been saved, Carol placed a life-size bronze sculpture of a 6-year-old boy, sleeping peacefully, protected by the fallen hero who'd given everything to keep him alive. The Wind Dancer Memorial was unveiled on a crisp October morning, 9 months after the rescue. The ceremony took place in the Wyoming Pioneer Museum in Buffalo, where the preserved stallion would be permanently displayed as the centerpiece of a new exhibit on animal intelligence and interspecies compassion. Over 300 people attended the unveiling. Tommy Fletcher, now 7 years old and healthy except for his missing toes, stood with his parents in the front row. Jake Morrison, looking older than his 72 years, wore his best suit and bolo tie. Dr. Michael Chen presented scientific data on equine cognition and behavior. Representatives from multiple wild horse protection organizations spoke about the intelligence and emotional depth of Mustangs. But the most powerful moment came when they removed the cloth covering the display and the crowd saw Wind Dancer for the first time, frozen forever in his act of ultimate sacrifice, protecting the small bronze child beneath him. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Jake was asked to speak, and the old cowboy approached the microphone with obvious reluctance. Public speaking had never been his strength. But as he looked at Wind Dancer's preserved form, the words came. "I've worked with horses my entire life," Jake began, his voice rough but steady. 72 years old, and I can't remember a time when horses weren't part of my world. I've seen horses do amazing things, pull loads that seemed impossible, jump obstacles that should have stopped them, run races they had no business winning. I've seen horses bond with humans in ways that bring tears to your eyes. I've seen horses mourn their dead, protect their young, and stand by their herd members in times of crisis. He paused, looking directly at the Mustang. But I never saw anything like what Wind Dancer did. This stallion left his own herd, his family, in the middle of a deadly blizzard. He traveled miles through conditions that were killing everything caught in them. He found a lost child who meant nothing to him in evolutionary terms, who shared no genetic material with him, who was from a completely different species. And he made a decision. Jake's voice broke slightly, and he had to pause to compose himself. Wind Dancer could have kept moving. He could have sought shelter for himself. Every survival instinct he possessed must have been screaming at him to find protection, to conserve his heat, to save himself. But instead, he lay down in the snow. He curved his body around Tommy Fletcher. He used his own warmth, his own breath, his own body as a shield against the storm. And he stayed there until he froze to death, never abandoning the child he'd chosen to protect. The room was absolutely silent, except for the sound of quiet crying. "Some people say animals don't think," Jake continued. "They say animals are just instinct and programming, that they can't make conscious choices, that they can't understand concepts like sacrifice or compassion. Those people are wrong. Wind Dancer proves they're wrong." This stallion looked at a lost, terrified child and saw something worth dying for. He made a choice that was fully conscious, fully deliberate. He chose compassion over survival. He chose to be a hero. Jake looked at Tommy, who was staring up at the preserved Mustang with wide, solemn eyes. "Tommy, you were given a gift. Not just the gift of survival, but the gift of understanding that courage and kindness aren't limited to humans. Wind Dancer showed you that a truly brave soul can exist in any form. I hope you never forget what he did for you. I hope you live your life in a way that honors his sacrifice." The ceremony concluded with the museum director announcing that the Wind Dancer exhibit would be free to the public and would include educational materials about wild horse conservation, animal cognition, and the ongoing debate about how to protect America's wild Mustang populations while respecting the ranching communities that shared the land with them. Dr. Chen announced that he was establishing the Wind Dancer Research Fellowship, a grant program to fund studies of equine intelligence and interspecies protective behavior. The Fletcher family created a scholarship fund for veterinary students who wanted to specialize in wild horse care. But perhaps the most moving tribute came from an unexpected source. The wild Mustang herd that Wind Dancer had led, the mares and foals he'd left behind on that fateful day, had been tracked by Dr. Chen's team throughout the year. The herd had been taken over by a new, younger stallion and had continued their normal patterns of movement and breeding. However, in late September, something unusual happened. The herd traveled to Eagle Ridge, a location they had no practical reason to visit, as it offered no particular advantages in grazing or shelter. And they stayed there for 3 days, the mares grazing peacefully, while the young foals played in the meadow at the base of the ridge where Wind Dancer had died. Dr. Chen couldn't explain it scientifically. There was no way the horses could have known what happened at that location. They couldn't possibly understand that their former leader had died there. But they had come, and they had stayed, and when they left, they never returned to Eagle Ridge again. "Maybe it was just coincidence," Dr. Chen said to Jake, showing him the tracking data. "Maybe it was just random herd movement that happened to bring them to that spot." Jake smiled sadly. "Or maybe horses understand more than we give them credit for. Maybe they have their own ways of remembering and honoring their own." On the 1-year anniversary of the rescue, Jake Morrison rode out to Eagle Ridge on Dusty, who was now 21 and showing his age, but still game for one more ride. Jake dismounted at the spot where he'd found Wind Dancer and Tommy, and he spent an hour there, just standing in the wind, remembering. He thought about the choice Wind Dancer had made, the choice that saved Tommy Fletcher's life but ended the stallion's own. He thought about courage and sacrifice and the mysterious ways that compassion could bridge the divide between species. He thought about how a wild horse had taught him, a man who'd worked with horses all his life, something new about the depths of what these magnificent creatures were capable of. "Thank you," Jake said quietly, to the wind and the mountain and the memory of a fallen hero. "Thank you for showing us what real courage looks like. Thank you for reminding us that heroes can have 4 legs instead of 2. Thank you for Tommy. Thank you for the gift of understanding that you gave us all." As Jake rode back toward town, a small herd of Mustangs appeared on a distant ridge silhouetted against the setting sun. They watched him for a moment, wild and free, and then they turned and disappeared over the ridge, running with the wind. Jake smiled through his tears. Wind Dancer's herd was thriving. His legacy was living on in every foal born to the mares he'd once protected, in every new generation of Mustangs running free across the Wyoming wilderness. And in a museum in Buffalo, a preserved stallion stood eternal watch over a bronze child, forever frozen in an act of ultimate sacrifice, forever reminding anyone who saw him that the capacity for heroism and love exists in all living things, if we only have the wisdom to recognize it. Wind Dancer's memorial at the Wyoming Pioneer Museum has been visited by over 500,000 people since its installation. Tommy Fletcher, now a teenager, volunteers at wild horse sanctuaries every summer. Jake Morrison, who passed away peacefully at age 78, left his ranch to the Bureau of Land Management with the provision that it be used as a wild horse preserve. Dr. Michael Chen continues his research on equine intelligence, with Wind Dancer's sacrifice providing the cornerstone case for his work on animal cognition and interspecies compassion. If this extraordinary true story of sacrifice, courage, and the mysterious bonds that connect all living things moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible animal stories that challenge how we understand the creatures we share this world with. Hit that like button, share this video to honor Wind Dancer's memory, and tell us in the comments, how has this story changed the way you think about animals? Thanks for watching, and remember, heroism isn't defined by species, size, or strength. It's defined by the willingness to choose compassion and protection over self-preservation, by the courage to stay when every instinct says to flee, by the capacity to love something outside yourself more than you love your own survival. Wind Dancer taught us that, and we should never forget.